You know, I'm not negotiating my departure. I'm just trying to bamboozle these foreigners a little while. So I'm going to sit here and be polite, and you keep on doing what you're supposed to do. And that's what they're doing beautifully.
It's been going on since the month of March, and that's what's amazing when you see those images. Those are big tanks we saw in Homs.
Big tanks and 4,000 dead. I mean, that's more than, what any of the other Arab Spring countries racked up before their leaders fell. So, I mean, the thing is, I just don't see what the end game is on either side. It just seems to me this.
Well, Syria, the Assad family, they're able to kill much more than that, because in the early 80s, I remember, was it 83 or so? Yeah.
83.
In Hama, that city, they killed a number that's not determined, between 10 and 30,000 people. They essentially killed absolutely everybody in certain neighborhoods, whether they were members of the Ba'ath Party or not, because they were moving in the direction of a Muslim Brotherhood uprising. And we have elements of that now. So, in fact, compared to what it used to be, he's not as bad as his father was. But it's
then
bad.
You could control information. I mean, that's the big, it took a lot, as you say, the fact that we don't even know how many. I mean, here, this, the world, the videos, the Twitters, everybody.
Now we know better than
we
in
know
83.
better,
Yeah.
and that's what I'm saying. I just don't see.
I think what was striking about that interview with ABC News was at one point when Assad was asked if he'd go if people wanted him to leave, and he said, I have support from a majority of the people. They want me to stay. And it really came across as someone who was clearly in denial, or
yes, well, it's megalomania.
It's absolutely.
There are also people who have
he does have supporters.
I think the question is whether, for instance, the latest economic sanctions can make it even more unpleasant and so on and so forth, but whether people then start to seep away from the regime. But it really seems like a real dead-end situation with very, very few outcomes that do not spell violence.
Do you get the feeling that there isn't as much support from the West in terms of toppling this leader compared with, say,
I think the issue is
how
Turkey again this Friday warning Syria that it would act to protect itself if a crackdown on protesters, this is a quote here, threatened regional security. Is the West, on that point, Harold Hyman, putting all its eggs in Ankara's basket?
Well, Ankara is the only government that can do something militarily. They could enter Syrian territory tomorrow morning and advance 20 kilometers and hold the whole border if they felt like it. And it would probably do them a lot of good. They would probably...
Are we getting closer to that?
Yes. But don't forget, they always have a double agenda in Turkey. Always. Always. The Kurds are foremost in the minds of any government. The Kurdish rebellion. And it's going on right now. So if they took the border, they move right into the Kurdish part, and then they can attack from the rear their enemies in Kurdistan. That is always in their minds. So even though they're distressed, and Erdogan and his party are distressed by what's going on in the streets of Syria, and they don't want a humanitarian influx, because who wants that? They do have ulterior motives. So you can say that the West is putting eggs in a basket that's already got a lot of other eggs in it.
Okay. And you can also ask, in that case, who the Syrians themselves can turn to. Reading a piece in Friday's International Herald Tribune, you get the sense, Alison Smale, that it's going to be tough counting on Syrians abroad, be they dissidents or insurgents. It's tough organizing an opposition.
Yes, and this is a particularly fractious situation, and very clearly it's not going well. I mean, the Turks have given a certain amount of support to the organization of the Syrian opposition and even an attached fighting force, but there doesn't seem to be complete unanimity, and our correspondent was down on the border and really reported very clearly on the differences that have always plagued, I think, such oppositions. It's terribly difficult in a society where things are very controlled, and as we've all said for many weeks now this year, the Assad family has controlled to such a degree, rather as the Gaddafis did in Libya, that you don't have really any strong civic institutions that are not outside of the family's control. So it's just hard to imagine how could the West do more. I mean, Libya was one thing, and it has a large coast and a smaller population and a vast empty interior. And Syria is sort of the linchpin, and if you take the kind of support out of that, then things really start to fall apart, rather as you have graphically illustrated with Turkey.
Mm-hmm. We can talk about another. Of course, Syria also has the backing of Russia, which is another point.
Well, I think the China and Chinese backing is much more passive than active, and I think the Russians have a lot of very good Middle East experts. They will be very careful not to overstep a certain line.
And they're still sore over Libya, that the Libyan United Nations resolution did not really explicitly allow for the scale of air operation that was conducted. So they're really sore. Now, they wouldn't have said yes, probably, but they're just sore. So they say, now we're not going to sign anything in the Security Council.
It's sort of interesting because, you know, one of the reasons they're sore is because they've never will like international interference in a domestic situation. Yeah. That's just been sort of part of their mantra since they were Soviets and since they stopped being Soviets. But, you know, the fact of the matter is the West, I mean, that's the interesting kind of convergence, is now in a similar situation. They don't want to get involved as they did in Libya. They don't want to, for all the reasons
they don't want
to
start something that they don't know whether they can stop.
I mean, you know, it's far too delicate and as Alison was saying, too much of a sort of linchpin for the whole region. So sort of actually that kind of non-interference has become a kind of a global position, not wished for, but I mean,
for the time being. Now, speaking of bruised egos in Moscow, here in France, where we're sometimes accused of being a little too well versed in industrial action, 2,000 people at a rally can seem very small, but for post-election protests in Moscow, it's actually a different story. Now, those protests coming from across the country, not just from the capital, after the internet was flooded with images, like the one in a Moscow voting station where an official behind a counter is caught red-handed filling in line 6 being United Russia, the party of Vladimir Putin. There you see him, he's filling it in. Celestine Bowen, this is Russia's first elections since the advent of the smartphone, and look what we've got.
I hadn't thought of it that way. No, I mean, I think you know, but it's many things. I mean, the fact is that it sort of came at a moment of sort of boiling point. Not everybody was aware of that, but I think the fact of the matter is that there's really...
But hang on, why is there a boiling point? The price of oil is going up?
Right. But I mean, I think the fact is that the sort of nature of the way the country is governed has been so unsuccessful in sort of managing people's aspirations and
IMF
sort of
growth figures, they're on the rise if you look at the big picture.
Corruption is so rampant that it's, you know, it's sort of basically out of control. And you know, I think that people just feel that they have, you know, they can't turn to the police will just ask them for money, they can't go to courts, the judges are bribed. I mean, it sounds exaggerated, but it's actually not. It's not. I mean, it's a sort of system. It's a feudal system, which is run by, you know, a clan that sits at the top, and then all the way through, they keep the sort of the lesser folk happy by letting them collect, you know, on bridges. I mean, so as they say, almost like we learned in a medieval, you know.
So let's compare then with the days of Boris Yeltsin. Is it? Was it just as dark then, worse? Is it better now? What's
No, I mean, I think Boris Yeltsin came to power and the whole dissolution of the Soviet Union happened almost exactly 20 years ago today, on a hopeful wave which was created during Perestroika, when Mikhail Gorbachev loosened the reins and people were allowed to discuss things more freely. And back then, I remember in 1989, there was a massive Congress of Soviet Deputies, it was called, and stirring speech after stirring speech, one of them very, very loud about how everybody was waking up from a tremendous slumber. And I think what's happened now is that over the course of the last 10 years, Putin has brought a degree of vaunted stability many people, not all people, but several people, have lived a little better, have been able to afford the vacation abroad and so on. But it's all been at the price of sort of this public silence. And now I think you had a lot of people on the streets, many of them very young. These are people who do not remember the chaos of the Yeltsin years. They've been told about it maybe by their parents, but they themselves didn't live through it. And a couple of articles that we ran this week, those young people were cited as saying, you know, I'm here because I just can't stand being lied to anymore. And I think that's the sort of cup runneth over aspect that seems to have caught the imaginations of other Russians. And we'll see how long that lasts.
How long it lasts. All this happening amid delicate negotiations between Washington, NATO, and Russia over things like Afghanistan, nuclear non-proliferation. And yet, and this is a throwback to a bygone era, the Obama administration talking very tough.
We expressed concerns that we thought were well-founded about the conduct of the elections, and we are supportive of the rights and aspirations of the Russian people to be able to make progress and to realize a better future for themselves, and we hope to see that unfold in the years ahead.
And before we get to Vladimir Putin's response to Hillary Clinton's words, when I was in Egypt a few weeks back, there were many people wishing that she would be speaking up publicly about the military in Egypt. Why be so outspoken when it comes to Russia?
That's a question I've been asking myself. And the same goes for Ashton. I think that the head of the EU foreign policy branch, I think they're ganging up on Putin because he used to be worse. He's getting a little bit better in time, and the system is getting a little less chaotic.
I would not agree. I would say the reason, to go back to your question, I mean, one thing is that this time there were OSCE observers. She was actually speaking at some kind of an OSCE event. And the fact is that those observers were not there in the last Duma elections. The Russians didn't allow them to come. This time they came, and actually I happened to be there and happened to go to their press conference where they not only stated the obvious, which is that this was not a fair election in the sense that the media the main television stations are very much loyal to the government, the election commission is not impartial, et cetera, et cetera. All that was known. But what struck me was that morning on Monday early, of the 150 districts that they had monitored professionally, this is in amateur videos and so on, 34 had cases of obvious ballot stuffing.
20%, that's huge.
Two things about that. One is they weren't there to say that last time, so this time we have credible witnesses very quickly off the ground. And secondly, I think that Putin's group was sufficiently worried about these elections that they went much further than they've gone in the past. I mean, the fact of the matter is
to stuff ballots?
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, I think
they didn't do it in the past. I mean,
they didn't need to. You know, this time there were signs that his majority was under some kind of question, and people were booing him, and he was, you know.
I mean, at the very latest. Since the September announcement, when he said, "I'm going to run again for president," I mean. Again, the cup runneth over. People said to themselves, what is this? We're supposed to have a choice, and they've made a deal.
The other thing is that, you know, the number of regions, the Moscow region, for instance, voted very strongly for the communists. Most striking was, which is amazing, that's an area where a lot of government workers, people who should have known better in the Putin point of view, the other was to the crews of two atomic submarines in the Northern Fleet, not one vote for the ruling party, which tells you people are a little fed up. And they know that, and therefore they felt they had to stuff the bank.
With an election still to come in March, just before we go, I want to get back to a point that you mentioned. 20 years ago this week, what was it, at a hunting lodge in, I believe it was the middle of a forest in Belarus. The presidents of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus decide to disband the Soviet Union. And effectively, Mikhail Gorbachev finds himself president of a state that no longer exists. When you look back now at that 20th anniversary, what are your thoughts when you look at those images, Alison Smith?
Well, I mean, I think that you can, I don't know, it's difficult to sum up very shortly. I think it is of raised and dashed hopes. I think it is of great potential. And I think it is, too, that it happened, at least at that moment, relatively peacefully. I mean, there were wars as the dissolution was happening, but people had feared, particularly after the ethnic wars that split Yugoslavia, that there would be much more bloodshed. I do think, there are lots of sources of instability within the old Soviet Union ripe yet for further worry and trouble.
And we'll continue to follow it. I want to thank you, Alison Smale, for joining us. I want to thank Harold Hyman, Video Root, and also I want to thank with us Celestine Bolin, and thank you for being with us here for The World This Week. Stay with us. Coming up next, it's time for business, and that's hosted by Marcus Carlson.